Thank you, Roland. We're going to talk about syntactic change and pragmatic maintenance. And the case study here is discourse particle readings for then over the history of English. I start with the examples I gave in the abstract. This is stuff that I based on the study by, what's her name? Deborah Schifrin's monograph on conversation analysis from the 80s. So in present-day English, you can have various positions for then in the modal particle reading. Initial, then why did you do that? Or why did you do that then? Final position. Why did you then do that is much degraded, but it's the original position in Old English, interestingly. And I've added a fourth order in brackets, and that's the WH incorporated. Why then did you do that? This is, the same kind of pattern as Bayer and Obernower, discuss in their article. I'll leave that aside. This pattern occurs throughout the history of English at very, very modest frequencies in the corpora that I looked at. Yeah. So the idea is that the use of then indicates a contingency on the information in the preceding context. You add then because there's it refers to the circumstance for asking the question. Yeah. So if it was so silly, then why did you do that? Yeah. So there's a reason to use then, or you ask the neutral question. Okay, I started looking at these various positions inspired by work by Alexander Haselow on the clause final use of then, the B order in present-day spoken English. He did a very interesting study on that. And he says what that does is convert a proposition P1 expressed in a preceding discourse segment into a conditional protasis, and thus marks the proposition P2 it accompanies as motivated by and directly linked to a preceding segment. So if P1, as is the case, P2 then. So this is why I use, for diagnosing the particle reading in the historical corpora, I use the paraphrase in that case. Yeah. Because that gives you a good indication as to whether you can figure out that that context is there, because of course there's also an abundance of temporal adverbs, and there are sort of subtly overlapping areas between the two, so you do need a diagnostic in this case, not to be fooled by your own semantic intuitions. An interesting question, of course, whether these four particle positions, have identical readings and have identical scope. I have no doubt that question is going to be raised at some point. So hypotheses, okay, my hypothesis is that these four different positions for then in present English questions have the same reading, except then that the third one is degraded in present-day English, and that these four readings are identical to the core particle reading for then in Old English. Yeah, I'll show that later. Over the history of English, these particle readings for then are remarkably stable. I was quite surprised by that, especially in view of the fact that the syntax of then, the positions for then, changed profoundly. In Old English, there is really only one position for the particle reading, and with very minor possibilities elsewhere, but it's fragmentary. So so that's an interesting situation, because there's library is full of research on grammaticalization in the history of English, and you'd think that a pragmatic particle that is short and that is unstressed and seems to play a minor role, might have been subject to that as well. But what we will see is that in the course of all these syntactic changes, so then sort of this pragmatic reading for then sort of wheedled its way to other positions and is still quite robust in present day English. Okay, why do I find this interesting? This is work in progress. I'm collecting case studies on how contextual factors, discourse factors, pragmatic factors interact with and impact on syntactic change and vice versa. So I'm interested in that interplay. And I note that this is a distinct issue from whether you want to use a big Riti style tree to incorporate all sorts of things about information structure. But it's about the interaction as you see it in syntactic change. And I hope that that's going to tell us a bit more about what you absolutely need in the syntax, and what you can do in other ways, describe in other ways, etc. This is one of those attempts heading for that kind of goal. Okay, on to modal particles in general. This is based on the literature on German and Dutch, because of course, as noted again by Ian yesterday, German and Dutch are pretty close to Old English. In the literature on German and Dutch, I haven't added all these lists of references. Again, there's libraries full of literature on particles, especially in German, much more than on Dutch. The consensus seems to be that particles are a closed class of functional elements with invariant form, that they're characteristic of interactive language. Okay, lots of people say spoken language, but I prefer interactive because you come across lots of interactive language in written language as well. They're typically unstressed. They contribute to common ground management, so common ground between speaker and hearer. That's this reference to the context that I was referring to. The pragmatic effect that they have matches with specific types of illocutionary force. We'll see that in a moment illustrated by Old English. They occur in fixed positions in V to C clauses, which in German means basically all root clauses, because it's generally assumed that all root clauses have a full force CP structure. That's not necessarily the case for Old English. They're generally considered a middle field phenomenon, so the area between the left clause bracket, indicated by the finite verb in C, and the right clause bracket, assuming that German is a more or less categorical OV language. And then on to Old English. The precursor of discourse particle then in Old English is thona. Of course, there are two temporal adverbs that qualify as particles potentially, and that is tha and thona. I only briefly include tha to contrast it with thona, and that will show that it occurs in different clause types and it has a different kind of effect. Thona occurs on a large scale in a fixed position in questions and imperatives, the middle field position as in 1C, the one that is degraded in present day English. And these are V to C contexts and thus represent special illocutionary types. Okay, I contrast them here with subject initial declaratives because they yield a very different picture in Old English, and one that I haven't quite fiddled out yet. But an interesting question in this from this perspective is, are subject initial clauses in Old English full CPs? I suspect the answer is no, but this is an unsettled issue. There's some recent literature on this. Okay, structure of the talk. I'll be, running by a number of diagnostics for particles in Old English. Discussing form and function and elocutionary force types and the position of the particle. Then I will look at the changes in Middle English and, draw some observations from that, which I think are rather interesting from a number of perspectives, but also leave open quite a few questions. This middle field position, what this is, my working hypothesis is that it's left of the little VP edge, following Teresa Bieberauer's work on peripheral significance. And her hypothesis there is that expressive and discourse structuring elements occur at phase edges, which is where language acquirers, fit them into the grammar as, that kind of stuff that is not part of the, strict lexical core, etc. Okay. In this talk, I will assume that this may also include the rightmost clause edge, where afterthoughts in unmonitored speech are added and later integrated in the clause. And this anticipates the rise of the use of clause final then as a particle that we see later on in the history of English. Okay, I mentioned interactive language. I get lots of questions about this. Can you study interactive language based on historical texts or based on written texts? And, the answer to that for Old English is wholeheartedly yes. Old English prose texts abound with quoted dialogue, especially sermons, saints' lives, stories, particularly the story of Apollonius of Tyre. One text is dialogue, the Old English translation of Boethius' Consolatione Philosophiae. And there's loads of moral treatises such as Cura Pastoralis, which rhetorically address an audience. So, there's a very, very striking number of particles, and in contexts where you recognize interactively intended language, at least. So Old English is a gratifying object of study here. This is much less the case in Middle English and later periods. We will see when we look at Middle English and later periods that there are some substantial sampling effects, lack of texts in a particular sub-period, lack of texts in a particular genre, etc. And what I did to counteract that is I thought, oh, well, there must be more examples in the corpus of early English correspondences then, because correspondences are closer to the spoken language, or even in the corpus of English dialogues. Unfortunately, that is not parsed yet, but and that's a lot more work. But I did searches in the corpus of the past corpus of early English correspondences, and I ran a number of pilots in the corpus of English dialogues, and I couldn't find a thing. So I restricted myself to the sequence of pen corpora, the pen parsed corpora, which also includes the York parsed corpora, and made do with what I found there. Okay, first of all, the matching preferences between particles and clause types. I've listed tha and thona here. This comes from, the first article I wrote together with Meta Links, which was published in Glossa early 2020. I contrast tha and thona there. The first table gives you the bare numbers. So we searched for specific clause types this is based on the York corpus of Old English. Various clause types, the number of each of the clause types, and then the incidence of the use of tha in those clauses and of thona. That in itself doesn't tell you much, of course. So the second table gives the same numbers, but normalized, and a specific number per 100 clauses. Yeah, so that's, you know, not a very substantial normalization. So that indicates a fairly robust frequency. And what you see there is quite clear. What you see there is these shaded cells, and that is where the matching preferences between particles and clause types are expressed. And what you see is not completely, of course, never completely, is you know, something that indicates a, you know, more or less complementary distribution of the use of tha and thona across clause types. Yeah, so thona occurs in questions, imperatives, and conditional correlatives, and tha occurs quite often in temporal correlatives as a temporal adverb, and in subject initial clauses. Yeah. So there's a clear semantic impact difference between these two particles. Thona occurs primarily in contexts where truth conditions are open, and tha is affirmative and also exclamative. I've left out the exclamatives out of this table, not to muddle it too much, but that indicates the same. Okay, the restriction to root V2C contexts. Okay, so as we saw just now, thona occurs with some considerable frequency in questions and imperatives. Yeah, so here are two examples. One of a question: why not should he then rightly, justly avenge? And an imperative: feed then my sheep if you love me. Yeah, so this "if you love me" gives you the context that that thona refers to. Yeah, so in that case, reading is a reading that, of course, very often applies in conditional contexts. Okay, so what's the you know, rough syntactic analysis? That's at the top of the slide. It's based on Josef Bayer's work on den in German. Yeah, so V2C context. So in that structure, the finite verb is in C. You have pronominal subjects preceding the particle phrase. Okay, the particle phrase has then as its head, functional head status, remember, and, you know, I've left the rest of the clause implicit. Yeah. So what you see when the particle in Old English is in what we can presume to be this middle field particle phrase, yielding the, in that case, reading rather than a reading in the direction of temporal adverb. The assumption is, moving to the bottom of the slide, that in that case, reading is triggered in context with V2C movement, and that V2C movement activates the illocutionary force of the clause, you know, question and imperative in this case. Subject initial clauses are still work in progress. You know, of course, there are many thousands and thousands of them, and the question is, you know, how to narrow down your observations. I'm still, well, maybe not struggling with it. I mean, there are some indications, but okay, some observations about subject initial clauses. I come across very few in that case readings. Yeah, if that is something that correlates with V2C movement, it might indicate that subject initial clauses in Old English are not V2C context. I think that's quite plausible, given that there are lots of verb second like contexts that are clearly not full CPs / false Ps in Rizzi's terms. There's a great deal of variation. I'm talking only about thona now, but the same goes for tha. Between S, then finite verb word orders, according to a recent paper by Nicolas Catasso and co-authors in the Journal of Historical Syntax, you know, the important outlet for the audience here. This is a topic marker. But there's also an enormous amount of S verb finite then, in which you get a simple and straightforward temporal adverb reading. Yeah, so what is precisely going on there is, something that I haven't fathomed out. Okay, so the question is, where is the finite verb in subject initial clauses? It's lower than C/force, I think. It's in the lower left periphery, perhaps, what I usually call F, but in the Reedsy terminology would be called fin, or maybe even lower in T. We don't know that. The structure on the previous slide, no, I've left that open, and I would like to continue to leave that open. So, so this is the picture for subject initial clauses. To the extent that you find in that case readings there, it's extremely diluted in comparison to the readings that you find in imperatives and questions, no doubt about it. But as I say, I haven't quite resolved this yet. Okay, what I've left out here is the preposed correlative clauses. Yeah, so these are temporal correlative clauses and conditional correlative clauses. And I'm leaving these out because, the particles at the same type of position in the preposed subclause, that is, but, these clearly have a different function and also a different reading. So we leave those out here. Okay, the position of the particle, here's one indication. Here's the clearest indication, I should say. The article I published about this with meta links was about more potential types of particles besides tha and thona. We included la and nu there as well. Well, la is a bit of a mess, but nu is included here too. This gives you word orders for questions with tha or thona or nu as a particle. Yeah. And so that gives you substantial numbers, as you see, and what you see is that personal pronominal subjects always precede the particle. There's multiple subject position effect that people working on the history of English are familiar with. Optionally, personal pronouns can occur there as well. Personal pronouns can also occur in lower positions, somewhere in the proximity of the little VP edge. Nominal subjects are divided between discourse given subjects and discourse new subjects, and that is reflected in the word order. So you see this clear demarcation here that particles provide, separating discourse given from discourse new material in the lower left periphery of the clause.
And we have 5 more minutes.
Oh God, am I going so slow? Okay, so then I'll skip the summary because I think that was pretty clear. Skip to Middle English, and I can discuss the facts fairly quickly because I've visualized most of them. Tha was lost in the transition to Middle English, and then you see new positions becoming available for the particle reading of den. Yeah, initial, piggybacking largely on available other structure. Yes, no questions, for instance, and there's a new final position popping up there, and well, we'll take a look at that later. This is a table of instances of questions. What you see there primarily is that the old middle field position is the most robustly attested throughout history, except perhaps in the modern British English corpus, which is the version I investigated is still rather small. There's a new release now, but I've ordered that, but I don't have it yet, so I haven't been able to look at that yet. Okay, and this is a couple of examples from early Middle English onward. Then imperatives, the behavior, the positions for the particle in imperatives tell us a lot about the loss of verb second, just as Kroch and Chung-Hee Han in a paper in the early 2000s showed with the rise of do support. What you see here, but you can see that more clearly in the graph I made. Yeah. So what happens in imperatives, the M2 bit in that graph, the second sub-period. Okay, that is a very clear sampling. In fact, that's a very small corpus. So if you ignore that, you see, fairly high orange curve from early on, and then in the transition from the M3 period, which is 1350 to 1420, to the M4 period, so you see a dramatic decline of V2C movement in imperatives. Okay, this coincides more or less with a loss of V2. Yeah, so this is visualized at the bottom of the graph. We have subject initial clauses here. In subject initial clauses, in Middle English, even more so than in Old English, you don't find particle readings, except for maybe a few exceptions. So the middle field position does not yield particle positions. And the final position always yields particle readings. Subject initial clauses also show you a lot about the loss of V to T movement, whether then is a particle there or not. But as I said, in these contexts, we don't come across many particle readings. But you see again this rather complicated looking table here, but I've cast that in two graphs as well. So what you see is here. What you see here is, the loss of V to T movement and the rise of auxiliation, the auxiliation of modal verbs and the rise of do support. Yeah. So where in subject initial clauses with a lexical verb, the graph on the left, again, M2 is a sampling effect. What you see is the blue line, the VF then word order declines dramatically in the transition from M4 to E1, which is the borderline between these periods is 1500, and you see that auxiliaries have always been in that position, and you don't see that much happening there except a bit of wobbly. Yeah, so what you see in subject initial clauses is the reflection of the loss of lexical verb to T movement. To pull these things together, if I can add a minute or two, Roland.
Take 1-2 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. So conclusions. Exclusive particle readings are found in questions throughout the history of English in all positions. Only the original position, the middle field position, is degraded in present-day English, and it's not evident from the corpora where I've been when that happened exactly. Imperatives possible in initial position, exclusive particle reading in the middle field position until this is lost as a result of the loss of V2. And then you see, I forgot to add that, then you see the final position in imperatives as well. And subject initial clauses, you get convincing particle readings only in the newly created final position. Yeah. So what was originally restricted to the middle field position in V to C contexts in Middle English extended to initial position, and if it did, largely piggybacking on available structure, such as the first position of yes/no questions. This was, extended to all clause types by means of the new final particle position. And why did this happen? Why was then not lost? And I think the answer to that must be that its pragmatic function was so robust in the spoken language, underneath all these corpora, that it found new syntactic niches circumventing the restrictions of syntax, in particular the middle field tightening as a result of the rise of verbal periphrases. Okay. And then, the question remains open when this middle field position in questions was lost. Then one final observation I've already mentioned. Introduction of utterance final then in the spoken language finds a nice parallel in a paper by Ad Volen and Ton van der Wouden a few years ago on Dutch final dan, which has the exact same function as then in present-day English has. And they took a close look at the corpus of spoken Dutch and found, complete equivalence in use between, dan in the middle field and dan in clause final position. So that this is, something that gets added as an afterthought in the spoken language seems perfectly plausible. And, my judgments about these data are that they're absolutely equal. So that's it. Thank you.